UrbanTalk would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and the traditional owners of the land on which we record this podcast, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. We recognise their continued connection to country and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to the UrbanTalk podcast, the show where we bring together communities, planners, developers and fresh ideas to shape the cities we all call home. UrbanTalk is all about bridging the gap between the industry professionals building our neighbourhoods and the communities living in them. We're here to make conversations about urban development transparent, accessible and we hope exciting. In each episode, we'll unpack the issues, challenges and visions that shape our cities. I'm your host, Belinda Barnett. It's never been lost on me that planning and development are difficult disciplines to explain. Let's face it, not everyone can readily conceptualise new built forms and planning controls. We're fortunate that technology is making great advances in this area. The laws that sit behind planning controls also adds another level of complexity, as does the myriad of specialist investigations that accompany each new development application or planning proposal. It's a lot. It's a lot for communities to digest. I've spent my career at the coalface of the development sector, working with both public and private sector proponents, helping them to explain their projects so that communities can participate in meaningful conversations about development outcomes. Helping to explain the complexity of development and to promote the sharing of knowledge and new ideas was one of the reasons we created the UrbanTalk podcast. So far on the podcast, our guests have been mostly industry professionals, academics, researchers and public officials. The last episode of 2025, we had Melissa Neighbour, who gave us more of a community focus. And we're continuing this theme in 2026 by examining one of the most well-known and established grassroots community organisations in Sydney, Redwatch. And today I'm delighted to have as my guest the spokesperson for Redwatch, Jeff Turnbull. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for the invite.
Oh, it's so good to have you. The name Redwatch begins with an acronym of the suburbs that you represent, so Redfern, Everleigh, Darlington and Waterloo. Between keeping locals in the loop and staying abreast with planning matters in the area, Redwatch has successfully advocated for better community outcomes at both a state and a local government level. Indeed, with over a third of Redfern and Waterloo being government-owned land, Redwatch has had to get very efficient at liaising with government and getting heard at the development table. Jeff, to start, can you explain what Redwatch exactly is, the role it plays in the community, and some of the background that led to its formation?
Yeah, so I guess the place we start is back in the early 2000s when there were issues in Redfern. Redfern was one of the last places to gentrify in the inner city. And children were throwing stones at buses up in Elizabeth Street. And Premier's Department came in and basically said, well, we're funding all these human services agencies when we've got these problems. So they initially came in and looked at human services. And then it became apparent that they were also looking at government-owned land. And the RED strategy came out, which basically showed that they owned a third of the area. Initially, they worked with the local South Sydney Council, but then they decided in the end of 2004 that they were going to transfer responsibility for those four suburbs to Frank Sarter and a new Redfern Waterloo Authority. So we went from having South Sydney Council to having the City of Sydney to having the Redfern Waterloo Authority all within a 12-month period and our own minister for Redfern Waterloo. So suddenly the community had to start thinking about how we're going to respond and support the community through this. So Redwatch came out of that. And we've been working on that for the last 20-odd years. And while some things have changed, there are large sites like North Everleigh that haven't changed at all. 20 years down the track, they're still sitting there. So one of the things that Redwatch has done during that period is to keep tabs on what's happening on those sites and to track that out on our website and to keep people up to date with what the sort of changes are that are happening. So part of what makes us a distinct organisation is that we were forced, if you like, into having to deal with the state government at that time when lots of other groups were just dealing with their local council.
So you've been involved with RedWatch pretty much since its evolution. So would you say that it was really the issue of the sale of government-owned land in the area that really got you involved in community advocacy, or was there another development issue that sort of motivated you?
So I guess I came from a social justice background, and having worked in the third world development area, working with communities. And so I was bringing up a small family at the time when all this happened. And because the initial interventions happened around the human services side of stuff, the parts of the community that you would normally expected to stand up in the area didn't. So my wife and I started doing an email update to keep people up to date with what was happening. And so that basically brought together my sociological training, because I'm not a planner, I'm a sociologist by training, and my involvement with the community into sort of doing something that needed to be done, and because there was no one else at that point in time was prepared to sort of step up and do it. And there were a lot of people around that had been tackling issues in a complex suburb for quite some time that were tired and were sort of, playing a more low-key sort of role. So there needed to be someone that stepped up, and there were a group of people that basically came together and formed RedWatch. And because I wasn't a part of any of the political groupings, but had already been doing these email updates, I was asked to come in as the spokesperson. So that's where I've been ever since.
Wow, it's a huge commitment that you've made. It's really interesting too that it started, I guess, not round a development issue as such. Like a lot of community groups, that is sort of like the reason they commenced to fight a development, maybe a specific development in a local area, but yours was much broader than that.
Yeah, no, it very much comes out of community. So one of the concerns that was there within the Redfern Aboriginal community was that what was happening as far as gentrification and the people being driven out of the area. So there was a real fear that Redfern could become like Fitzroy in Victoria, where the Aboriginal community were in the 70s and 80s, and then basically got pushed out. Or potentially you could end up with Aboriginal controlled organisations in the area, but no people living there that were using those services. So there was real concern about having a voice in that process. And a lot of the people that still lived in the area were people from those old working class roots that didn't know what was going to happen to them. And we've seen that in terms of that sort of rental community, whether it's the students or whether it's the sort of old working class basically pushed out and now only confined to public housing.
You've got RedWatch has had a long memory and a strong, long presence, as we've talked about. And one of the things I think that is really impressive about your organisation, and to me, it's, information is always key in like bringing communities together and being able to achieve like great outcomes, is your impressive website. Like it's a great website, the way it sets out the history of the locality, the battles that you've fought. It's moving into all of the, explanations of planning controls. It's an incredible local resource, not only for your community, but also for people that find themselves working on projects within your area. It's a great starting point for them. And it's a huge credit to your work, because I know the amount of work that goes into maintaining a resource like that. And I mean, in my mind, it is really something that sets your organisation apart from a lot of other community organisations. In your mind, what do you think sets you apart from other community organisations?
So I think part of it is, you're right, in terms of the role that the website plays, because one of the problems that we have is that we have this continual turnover of people that we're dealing with, right? Not only turnover in the community as people come and go, but also in terms of who we're dealing with within different parts of government or within council or within different government authorities. And so we quite often hear back from new people that have come in to work in the area how valuable they find the website, because within government they can't get access to information about what's gone on before. So that part of it, I think, is really important. But I think it's also that one of the things that made us different was that we were dealing very much with a state government where most other groups were dealing with their local council. Our relationship with council is very different because council also is dealing with the state government about sites being pulled out of its control and spot zonings and it not being consistent with its strategic planning. And so we work with council to try and also sort of, if you like, leverage some of those outcomes. So give you a good example on that. When the Australian Technology Park was being sold, we asked council whether they would do a risk-benefit analysis of that sale. They brought in some consultants and did that, and then we used that to leverage with urban growth at the time. Things like community access covenants, covenants around what was going to happen with the treatment of heritage, access to community facilities on that site, and a range of other things that were necessary to make sure that it didn't become just a privately owned site, but that community access was available through that. So that's an example of how we've done that. We've also done it in terms of other activities that where we have mutually aligned interests. Sometimes our interests aren't aligned, but sometimes they are.
And you're very innovative. One of the things I guess the stories or things that initiatives that you pursued that's written about on your website was when you ran bus tours for elected members of parliament around Redfern to raise awareness of the government's policy to sell off Redfern at that time. And I love how you set out a flyer to parliamentarians titled "See Redfern Before Frank Sells It."
Yes.
I thought that I just love that.
And that's been that was important at the time in terms of getting the buy-in from parliamentarians because at that point, it was a Labor government. They didn't control the upper house, so we needed to work with the Liberal Party and the crossbenchers to actually get changes made to the Redfern-Waterloo Act when it came in. Originally, it didn't have any objects in the Act, for example. It would have allowed Frank to expand the Redfern-Waterloo area out to the airport if he wanted to. So we needed to put some sort of limits around that. So we worked very closely with people in the upper house to do that. And that's an important part of what we do. But the other side of things, we also still do guided tours for architecture students.
Yeah, which I love.
And we back in the early years of the of urban growth, we also did them for the Department of Planning. So we had bus tours where people who were going to be working on the urban growth corridor could actually come on a bus tour where they had a spokesperson from urban growth and myself from the community, and we went through and basically talked people through what some of the issues were within the community from both a government and a
I think that's brilliant.
Government perspective. But then within a short period of time, if you like, the comms people took control of the department over from the community engagement people, and all that went down the gurgler. So,
those dreaded comms people. So looking back, I guess would the sale of land, would that be the biggest fight that you've taken on, or are there? I mean, you've talked about the North Everleigh Park as well. What are some of the other really big concerns that really occupied you in the early days?
So it was primarily, one of the biggest ones was around the Aboriginal Housing Company, because when Frank Sarter came in, he had a cabinet directive that, given that the housing company wouldn't sign over control of the housing company for 15 years, that the government no longer supported Aboriginal housing on the block. There was a study that basically said that having Aboriginal housing next to Redfern railway station reduced the revenue that was likely to come from that development by 25 to 30%. And Frank took to that with some vigour, including telling Mick Mundine to get his black ass in and see him and to sort that out. But that really galvanised the community, because you had an Aboriginal-owned housing company that owned the land And then Frank came in and used the planning system to try and stop that from happening. So they went from 1-to-1 residential in the first draft of the plan down to 0.5-to-1. And so it wouldn't end up in the Land and Environment Court. They had an amount on top of that that could be commercial. But they're a housing company. They wanted to build housing and they couldn't within that. So even in the final version, it was set 0.75-to-1. And then the housing company had to try and work out how it could actually squeeze stuff in. It came up with a plan, and then they changed the planning controls so it had to be on particular blocks. It couldn't actually be congregated into one spot. So we went through what basically was a 10-year battle for the housing company to finally build the Pemulwuy project, which was sort of frustrated right at the beginning. So it was that sort of disrespect for community, getting stuck into the Aboriginal community, then trying to play different voices within the Aboriginal community off against one another, that really did not go down well. So that was some of the early concerns. For a lot of the other concerns, it was really about things like they rezoned the large erecting shop on South Everleigh as a 12-storey building on the basis that it wasn't of sound structure and was going to fall down. And we worked with rail groups on that to prove that that wasn't the case. And then the last thing that the Redfern Waterloo Authority did was rezone that back to existing height. So you had things like that were happening. If you fast forward, our main concerns now, while I'm on South Everleigh, maybe the best thing to say is that one of the big fights we had there was to keep an active blacksmith in operation. And in the end, when the DA was done by Mirvac for the redevelopment of the locomotive workshops, the DA said that the blacksmith was allowed to operate 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and all tenants coming into the development needed to be apprised of the fact. So having that fight, what people in Mirvac said was delivering one of the most expensive loading docks that they'd ever put into a development, but it preserved the heritage because there was all this heritage equipment that had been passed over to them as part of the sale that they needed to have responsibility for. So there are things like that. And then more recently, it's around public housing and trying to ensure that the dealings between the government and public housing tenants actually are happening in a way that take public housing tenants with them and address some of those issues.
A lot of these issues are they're quite involved. Like where do you source your expertise? You've obviously got a very a huge cross-section of people living across the area that you represent, which most probably incorporates a lot of some really vital skills. Is that how you where you source your expertise? You have an issue and people come forward and help you and, help you with your arguments?
Yes, so sometimes it happens like that. Sometimes it's about knowing the lay of the land and who you need to go and talk to to try and get a particular assistance on a particular area. So we have monthly meetings, some of which are focused around a development. So they become a community sandpit, if you like, where we ask developers or people from government to come in and talk about what they're going to do and basically in a transparent manner with the rest of the community. But sometimes that might be someone coming in and explaining what a social impact assessment is supposed to be, or what health, how do you assess health impacts or well-being, or other areas that sort of impact on that. So you try and build up the community's understanding of what those issues were. And that was particularly important when we were leading into the rezoning at Waterloo, because public housing tenants were not engaged in the planning system. It's stuff that's all foreign to them. And so we needed to do a lot of capacity building to try and help people to understand what was happening. Now, the problem with that capacity building is if you build up people's capacity and then the system doesn't actually respond to that, then you end up with a whole pile of disillusioned people who say, well, why bother? This is what I thought was going to happen. I was going to turn up and no one was going to listen anyhow. So then you have to deal with that issue. And in the case of Waterloo, it's been going for 10 years and you've got a lot of exhausted people who are now going back and redoing the rezoning so that it fits what Stockland wants to do on that site. And a lot of the communities just want it over and done.
Exactly. Yeah, that whole engagement fatigue is
Yes.
exhausting.
Yeah. And it's not helped. So we around the first rezoning back in 2022, because the department had taken that over from the City of Sydney, they were the planning proposal authority, so they needed to be involved in the exhibition part of that process. But they promised the community that they would see a response to submissions that actually detailed what the community said and how they responded to it. And then the department, in its wisdom, gave it off to an external consultant. And when it came back, tenants looked at it and said, well, I can't see what I said, let alone a response to it. And so it's those sort of breaks in faith that basically then have implications further down the track in terms of people saying, well, why do I bother?
Yeah, people come disillusioned.
I sit in meetings with tenants who, with Land and Housing Corporation and Stockland, and they will be asked a question and I'll say, well, you know what we said. We've said it a number of times, but no one's listening, but I'll say it again if that helps you. And so it's people not feeling as though they've been valued. That's important in that process.
Yeah. Do you look at advocacy outcomes as being like a win or a loss? Is it black and white for your community organisation when you take on an issue or a fight, or how much do you find yourself having to compromise?
In the development game, you very seldom win. So it's about knocking the rough edges off things, trying to get something that delivers things that the community wants, not just what the developer wants. Right? And that's one of the big problems, because developers will quite often come in, see the community as oppositional, not think that they can actually learn anything from the community, not see that this is an opportunity also to take a community with them and give something that the community can actually wants as well. And so you end up with this sort of disingenuous community engagement. But it also has another implication, that is that quite often it's done by the community engagement consultants who are basically there to prepare a report, and it isolates out the planners and the architects who might benefit from some of that, from that process as well, in terms of them hearing things directly. So trying to meet with some of those specialists can be a real chore on many projects, because you can only deal with the community engagement people. You can't talk to the people behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's all changing, because I don't know. I mean, I've been in the community engagement space for a long time, and that's certainly not how I approach my engagement. It's very multidisciplinary, and it is very much about bringing the architects and the planners and the traffic consultants together with the community to solve the issues. I mean, to create a real dialogue.
So that works better in strategic planning, which is one of the reasons why we really encourage more resources to go into strategic planning, because that's the stage where you can have more of those in-depth conversations, and you can bring people with you in terms of developing a master plan and where the zoning might go with that. The difficulty, however, is that when you're working through a government process, then they put it out to tender, then you then have to go through the process again, because the party that wins the tender needs to make the changes to it to actually deliver what it is that they want to deliver on the site. And so you then end up with sort of things that happen more like spot zonings rather than like sort of longer term in-depth strategic planning.
What would you say Red Watch's greatest achievement's been so far?
Oh, putting up with this for 20 years would be a start.
Longevity.
But that goes alongside the website. We're in some sense the corporate memory that government doesn't have around different parts of this site. But there are also things that we can point to that are concrete outcomes in terms of things like I mentioned, as far as the South Everleigh site and the heritage. I mean, we really pushed hard to make sure that we got some of those deliverables out of that process. So they're the bits that you look at and you say, well, that wouldn't have happened unless we had been there. Do you stop developments. No, that you try and massage them so that they give something to the community as well as to government. Having said that, I mean, there's all these things that we were promised when the Redfern Waterloo Authority came in, like a bridge that was going to, pedestrian and cycle bridge that went from Carriage Works to South Everleigh. One of the things the community was going to get out of this, and 20 years afterwards, we're still fighting for that to be delivered, and we're told, it doesn't add value to the site, and it's going to be too expensive and all that sort of stuff. But breaking that backbone that's there, that railway sort of corridor that separates those parts of the site, would go a long way to actually giving 15-minute sort of connections between the university and, say, Commonwealth Bank on the other side, or between people that are going to Darlington Public School and having to go to Alexandria Park on the other side. So, we're working on the arguments for that and trying to do what we did back in 2011 or so, where we put together a community campaign. That one back in 2011 was called Lift Redfern. It was about getting one lift onto Redfern Station while they were trying to sort out what they were going to do with the developments around it. And we were successful in that campaign in getting a lift to sort of tide us over until we got the more desirable outcome, and we still don't have a lift down to platforms 11 and 12 on the eastern suburbs line. But I mean, you have to work on campaigns and things that you can win, and that you can find a way that people can deliver. And that involves talking to everybody. We sit down and talk to developers and senior people in government on and off the record, depending on how that needs to happen. Because otherwise you don't know what's happening. You don't know where that thinking's going. You're not in a position to influence stuff if you're not being as transparent as you possibly can, and encouraging them to be as transparent as they possibly can.
Do people like new developers, are they actively seeking you out? So to sit down with you and talk to you proactively before they even start?
So there's some of that that happens with private developers who basically are told that they need to do some community pre-engagement before they lodge. So they look around at the residents groups and then sort of say, well, can you come and talk to us about this? And sometimes we've got an interest in that, and sometimes we don't. It's really annoying for many of the Aboriginal communities who continually find people coming wanting to get their opinion on stuff when they're actually trying to get on with their own stuff. It's one of the things that Red Watchers tried to do historically, especially around the AHC stuff, was to try and provide a little bit of a buffer around that by translating what we were being told from the Aboriginal community back out into the broader community.
What's your main hope for the area over the next decade?
Well, I would like to see some of the vacant government land that's been sitting there for so long actually have something done with it. Right? We are in a desperate need for more affordable and social housing. While we've got a general thing about accelerating housing, it's the actual affordable and social housing bits that are really lagging at the present moment. The new town end of the North Everleigh site was given over as surplus government lands to go over to Land and Housing Corporation for a 50% affordable and social housing and private development. It's still sitting there. At the same time as we're being told that cutting residents' input on planning from 28 days to 14 days is accelerating the housing system, and yet here's a major block that could actually do something that is actually just sitting there. And it's really important, because doing stuff on those brownfield sites basically means that you can actually put up new housing without having to relocate people. The problem with the model that they've got in terms of redeveloping places like Waterloo South is that you have to move the people that are there, and you have to find somewhere to move them. And if you don't have somewhere new, then basically what happens is you stop taking people off the wait list going into public housing, because you're now pushing those people that you're relocating to the top of the agenda. And so it just constipates the whole of the sort of that local housing system. So doing stuff that actually generates that new housing is really important if you want to do that. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a redevelopment happening on Waterloo, but what I'm saying is that the way in which it's been handled, the government really isn't making that easy on itself or on its tenants.
Because a lot of that relocation of those existing tenants, they'd be looking to move out of the area.
So yes, so you've got, what happens is you've got some people who want to stay. That's their community, and they don't want to move out of Waterloo to go to Redfern or even to Glebe or Woolloomooloo. They want to actually stay in Waterloo. You've got some people who want to get, this was what they got offered. They didn't want to be here. They'd prefer to be down in the South Coast with, relatives, right? So it's those people that quite often take a long time to relocate. Yeah. And similarly, people who need to have modifications done to the buildings so that they can actually relocate safely. So they're the bits that slow the system down. But in Waterloo South, it's even more complex because many of the people that are in those low-rise buildings are people that were put there because they were suicide risks and couldn't go into towers, or people that have height anxiety and other things. So when they started offering people sort of locations in high rise for those people wouldn't take them, didn't want them. It was a risk. So they're also dealing with the fact that they've got a low rise community where people have been put because it's low rise, and then you want to replace it with high rise. So that's another complication that they have. And I think right through it, one of our concerns around the Waterloo redevelopment was that the densities were pushed up so much and no one really was sure. We get told by people like Tim Williams that to make those sort of precincts work, then you have to actually curate those in the longer term to make sure that they actually deliver what you want, right? So even if you can do that for your normal, whatever that is, community, how does that work for people that are coming in that have cognitive disabilities and drug and alcohol problems, and the people that are coming and being put into public housing as priority? Does that high density situation really work for those people? And then tenants quite often will say, well, when I'm next to other tenants, people know what to expect. This is our community and we look after one another. If I'm going to be in a building next door to privates, they're more likely to be on the phone very quickly to call the police because someone's making a noise out there, rather than recognising that diversity. So there's a level of anxiety that's also there, and at the same time you've got some of the older public housing cohort who are the old working class people who'd much prefer to be in with the affordable housing people who are old workers like them, rather than actually in with the people that have come out of prison or having psychiatric issues or whatever. So it's a complex area, and then just to come in and say this is going to work in a very high density site, we're not fully convinced that it's going to happen. So there's a risk that, in the same way as we're looking at what was built 60 years ago in terms of the high rise, which people said, oh no, is dysfunctional and we need to pull it down and start again, we may well be back at the same thing in 60 years' time, thinking that we've done a much better job now, but it may not turn out that way. And it may not turn out that way because things like well-being and social impacts and stuff like that.
Yeah, and just the provision of social services aren't there.
Yeah, are not in an important place as far as the planning system is concerned. Right? It's about putting stuff up and putting it up as quickly as it possibly can so there's more housing.
Yeah, but then as you say, there are all these sites left vacant.
Oh yes,
which could be under DA at the moment. Let's talk about government and consultation and drill down on that a little bit more. So what does good consultation look like to you? In your experience, has government become better or worse consulting with the community?
So for me, good community engagement starts early, preferably at strategic planning level, so that communities can be involved in discussions about where density goes within their communities, within their neighbourhoods, and what needs to come alongside that, and what those communities might look like further down the track. Ideally based on good urban design studies that actually look what's there and what might be able to be changed and what might be suitable to be kept. The problem, of course, is that it's very difficult to get people to be involved in that
at early stage.
At early stage. But that's what sets the heights and the floor spaces, that then when it pops up next door to someone with a DA stage, they say, oh, where did this come from? Right? Yeah. So we had a classic, one of my favourite sort of NIMBY stories, we had a classic in Redfern with the first of the 18-storey towers was built. And they started to consult on the second of the 18-storey towers in that sort of belt that was going to be built. The people in the first building formed a community group to stop overdevelopment in Redfern. Right? They clearly hadn't done their due diligence when they moved into the building. So it is that sort of, people react to what happens at that DA stage and next to them. Rather than either doing the work and understanding enough about the planning system to be able to say what is likely to happen around me, but also that being involved early in the process.
What does good consultation like that? What does that early consultation look like to you to be effective? Is that when you feel that we should be sitting down with the architects and the urban designers doing a bit more sort of scenario planning and like the sort of like if we did this here, then we could do that here?
Yeah, so I think that's what happened. I mean, the City of Sydney is just in the process of doing stuff around their housing strategy that they've just put out, because the state government said you've got to fit in a whole pile more houses into the area, and they've put out a strategy of where that's going to go, and they'll have meetings with the community, and there'll be conversations about how that might work. They're being a little bit sneaky in primarily pointing to government-owned sites that aren't doing things, and that's the other part of the problem, that you end up you go through a process, as we did with the City of Sydney around their urban design stuff before the RWA came in, and then they basically come in over the top of this and pull sites out as state significant, and then effectively do spot rezonings of sites without looking at them in their broader context and how they interact with everything else, on even traffic, let alone sort of other bits and pieces. So that gets very difficult, because then you just are dealing with a particular site and it's out of context. And we've argued right through that there needs to be some cumulative assessments happen within this. But you've got a fundamental conflict, I think, with government and government sites, in that government wants to maximise their return. They're no different from a developer. They want to maximise their return on their site. And so they will push the controls to get the best deal that they possibly can, which may not necessarily be in the interest of the surrounding community. So it's and that then also further erodes that trust in government.
So is there, can you pinpoint, I know you talked a little bit about, we touched on communication specialists and maybe a change that is occurring within engagement, that there's a new breed of consultant that has arrived on the scene, being a communication specialist that takes on board the community engagement, I guess, process. Is that a problem? Do you see with how things are being done now? Is it becoming all a bit too slick?
So yes, it has become slick, but I think there's the community engagement side of stuff. From our perspective, the stuff that we've seen, I mean, again, it depends on the point of time. It depends on who's running an organisation. It depends on the developer, right? Because some people do that better than others. It comes back to what the starting instructions that have been given to the consultant, how much they're prepared to pay them to do what, right? So it's a bit like the social impact assessments sort of side of things, right? If you don't want much, then you basically, say, well, we've got this amount for doing a social impact assessment, go deliver us something. And Then you've got an assessment officer that looks at it and doesn't know anything about social impact assessments and basically said, no, that looks fine to me, and waves it through. So the same sort of thing happens on the community engagement side, unless you've got sort of a very sort of loud community, if you like, that says, no, that wasn't what we said, and pushes back on that. So I talked earlier on about how one of the things we do is we have people into what we call our sandpit. And that's to provide a level of transparency. We had a development recently where the developer basically put on an online webinar with sort of Q&A. We had no idea of how many people were in that. All we knew was that we were putting questions in and they weren't being answered. Right. So on the other side of things, you don't know whether or not there's a huge number of people there. So they just didn't get to your questions, or whether what was happening was that the questions were being curated so that the ones that were sort of more acceptable were being answered rather than something else. So there are things like that worry me sometimes. We've had one of the best community engagement sessions I saw was done by Urban Growth, where they did an exercise at the Australian Technology Park, where they actually sort of had a number of stations throughout this large building that you could go and talk to transport people here and right round. Right? Really good process. The only problem was that the site that they were dealing with was the bays, right? Yeah. So it was so far removed for anybody that wanted to try and get by public transport from there to the ATP. I mean, you had yours and Buckley's, but the process was good, right? Yeah. So it's also a bit like quite often when people want to get community feedback, they present a list of what it is they think the community might want as a starting point, and then say, oh, well, if you've got anything else, you can add it, rather than actually having a process that actually draws out of the community what their concerns are and what they want, and then works from there. So there are various tricks of the trade. And I guess, as an example of how things work sometimes, many years ago when we were having a fight with Urban Growth around community engagement, we got Wendy Sarkissian to do an article for Inner Sydney Voice that I was editing at the time. She pointed out that there was a very good guide that had been done years before by Landcom about how to actually go about consulting the community. And this was still sitting on the Urban Growth website, and maybe they should actually look at it and use it. Right? Within a couple of days, that document disappeared, never to be seen again. Right? So different people respond differently to what they think is good or not good. And I guess the place where we're finding it difficult at the present moment on the comms side of stuff is that Land and Housing Corporation is trying to manage the developer and the consortium in Waterloo within an inch of its life, to try and make sure that it doesn't want the developer saying one thing, them saying another, and various other CHPs and the consortium saying different things. But you end up in a situation where messaging is very tight. You can't actually get a sensible answer to a sensible question.
Is it just so high level?
Yeah, well, it's all high level. It's high level. Right?
Umbrella answers.
And we got a people and place strategy that was so high level that it went in draft form from having actions to recommendations, and even the recommendations were qualified within an inch of its life, and then became optional if someone wanted to pick it up. This was going to deal with the people part of the public housing redevelopment, as opposed to the building part. Right? So you're continually fighting these little battles, trying to get different parts of government to actually level with the community, and for the community to be in a position to try and influence that.
Yeah, it makes it difficult. When Premier Rann introduced the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act in 1979, and the inclusion of its community participation provisions, as limited as they were still heralded as a major win for communities. And the provisions, as you know, were a direct response to the green bans that Jack Mundy, used when he fought to save the rocks. And I guess as we work as a nation to solve the housing crisis, or we try to work together to solve the housing crisis, community participation is often branded as part of the red tape that's holding back or slowing development. And that sort of annoys me. And communities speaking out against development now often get framed as NIMBYs. What do you think of this framing? Like, do people come out to Red Watch and say, "Oh, you're nothing but a NIMBY group"?
Oh well, no, I've had people say that.
How does it make you feel? Because you're clearly not. There's so much depth there.
So look, I don't find the framing useful. I think it's a term that's used in a derogatory fashion that underestimates what are often legitimate reasons why people react to a development that comes up next to them, whether they be economic, social, psychological, and that you need to work through those issues with a community and look at the sort of, if you like, the broader good that's behind something and the sort of local impacts, and then, are the things that communities reacting to real or unreal, and work through a range of issues. So I just find the NIMBY sort of thing not helpful. We did a session on NIMBYs many years ago that we invited Chris Johnson, who was at the Urban Task Force at the time, because he was running around talking about NIMBYs this and NIMBYs that. So we invited Chris along, and we went through this whole discussion about NIMBYs. Chris became a member of Red Watch after that session, and funnily enough, if I was sitting in a group that Chris started to go down the NIMBY rabbit hole and he saw me, he'd look over and say, "Oh yes, but not all groups are NIMBYs. Red Watch isn't a NIMBY, and I'm a member of them." People should have paid me to follow me around, I reckon. So, but it is that sort of derogatory term that people use, and I don't think it helps us address the problems. Now, that's not to say, we need to be building more in the city. We can't spread the way in which we have been. So, yes, in my backyard is, I want that to happen. But if government decides to resume my backyard in my terrace to put a road through there, well, I'm probably going to have a couple of things to say about that. Or I'm probably not yes in my backyard in that situation. So is that a NIMBY response? Well, let's work through why they want the road and whether or not it's a better place to put the road, and a series of other questions, which are quite logical questions for people to want to have the answer to, and to then work out whether or not this is a useful thing. I mean, one of the things that didn't help things were the compensation payments that were offered to some people where their homes were repossessed, and that didn't help to offset the sort of impact that those decisions were being made on there, and just made the government look cheap. And quite often we need to be looking at, okay, if someone is going to be severely disadvantaged by something that we need to do, then how do we compensate them for that? How do we actually make that work for them and the community around them, as well as for the greater good?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly in my experience of consultation over the past 30 years, I mean, it's every project that I've worked on where meaningful consultation has been undertaken, not an information process, but a consultation process, it's certainly always led to a much better outcome, because nobody knows an area as well as the people that live in it. It's consultants that come in, even frequently within councils, people working within councils. I mean, they can bring all the expertise in the world, but very few are actually living in the area in which they're working.
Yeah. No, that's right. But you also got to have a developer or a proponent that actually thinks that they could learn something from the local community, and that's going to add some value. Because if they don't think that, then they look at the community engagement as basically trying to map out who might have a go at them during the exhibition that they need to head off.
Oh, as I said, it just becomes slick. It becomes a tick-the-box function. It's not, as you have said, often a lot of what the community is actually providing during the process isn't making its way to the architects or the urban designers, or the other consultants on the team that are responsible for delivering the final outcome. They're sort of completely separate processes, and sometimes they might be run in parallel, but there isn't that cross-fertilization of ideas occurring that I feel used to occur, but for some reason I just feel like it's, as I said before, it's just become all too slick.
Yeah. The planning system is delivering different outcomes to what it was originally intended to. You went back to Neville Red. I mean, a whole pile of those things were put in place, and then over the decades they've been whittled down to the point where a whole pile of those protections are no longer there.
Yeah. I mean, as an organisation, you have so much, and you personally, you have so much experience to share in community advocacy. Do you mentor? Does Red Watch mentor other community interest groups in Sydney?
So we certainly mentor people who come in. So one of the things about it, I guess, when you're dealing with 4 suburbs, is it's more difficult to find people who have that broader commitment to what it is that we're on about in terms of monitoring what's happening and working with community and stuff like that. So that's very different from a group that forms around a particular project that's, next door to them. So that means that we do have to work with the people that are coming in so that they have an understanding of our history, why we do things the way in which we do, how we do things. And that's an important part of the growth process that people go through being involved in a group like Red Watch. We work with other groups. So, for example, around candidates forums, we work with adjacent groups to put those on, or we're working on this campaign over the bridge from Carriage Works with Friends of Erskineville and Alexandria Residents Action Group to form a new sort of alliance that we're calling the Everleigh Bridge Alliance. But also more broadly, we go along to sessions and throw in our experience into things that council puts on, because there are other people in other parts of council that are dealing with the state government. I mean, it's not just a Redfern, Waterloo area problem. And then at varying points of time, we've worked with other groups more generally. We put together a planning document many years ago now with peaks like the Tenants Union and Shelter and the National Trust around planning principles that we were trying to get traction on. So we lend our support and our experience where we can, but it's quite often to other people that are dealing with other parts of government, because we know that system much better. And having said that, there are some bits of government that are much easier to work with. So, classic example being if a developer puts in a DA, it goes onto the planning portal and you know about it immediately. You can see what it is they're going to do, and then you can start work immediately with people saying, look, this is what the proposal is, this is where it is, this is what they're wanting to do, before they've even got the seers for that project. Quite often with council, it's a more curated process, and you don't know that it's underway until you actually get a DA coming out, because it's not as transparent as the system is for with the Department of Planning. So there's some ups and downs in that. But then other areas, it is easier to work with the city because you can have more nuanced conversations about where this fits into a broader strategy than you can't really have those with government, where they're only looking at a small sort of area that they want to spot zone and pull out.
How do you find your relationship with councillors, elected representatives within local government? I'm interested in this, and it might be different because it's the city of Sydney, but like with some local councils, what I'm noticing with elected representatives, if they've almost become disengaged from planning matters because of the formation of independent or local planning panels, and they just see that they have no ability at all to influence decisions. Yeah. And it's sort of come, I don't know, I think it's a little bit, it concerns me because, local government's important because it's the closest level of government to communities. But yet And development is important because it shapes the areas in which we all live. But because of this move that we have to local planning panels, and I think the local planning panels work well, don't get me wrong, that's a good initiative. But we've lost this connection between, I feel in some councils, between elected representatives and the communities and their constituents. And I'm sort of thinking, how do we address that?
Yeah, look, I think it's a little bit more complex than that too, because I think those that do pick it up and beat a drum that they can no longer influence.
Yes.
And therefore they can be sort of seen to be sticking up for a part of the community that isn't happy with something, and not have any influence. So it's the equivalent of sort of basically denying stuff, sending it off to the Land and Environment Court so that they can make the decision, so you don't have to worry about it when you come up to your council election. Look, the way in which we deal with things in the City of Sydney, and in the City of Sydney, they're very important in terms of strategic planning and in terms of the political clout that they have back with the state government over sites as a council. So we have a different working relationship with them. It depends a little bit on what the issue is as to whether or not I go, say, for example, to the CEO and ask her to do something, or whether I go to the office of Lord Mayor. I don't normally go to individual councillors because I don't want to get caught up in the party politics of individual council discussion. If we're going to council, I would normally write to all councillors and basically say, this is what Red Watch thinks on something, this is what we would like to see happen. Because it's very easy to get caught up in the councillor on councillor battles within council, or get caught up and be where people to think, you're only dealing with the Labor Party, or you're only dealing with the Liberals, or or whatever. So we try and stay out of that as much as we can. We do work closely with the Office of Lord Mayor on a number of issues. That's primarily because Clover writes the letters, and so you need to have that relationship. And there would normally be somebody from Clover's office that would come to a Red Watch meeting and then report back.
Would that be most meetings that you hold?
Yes. Yep.
So are they? That's fantastic. That's really good.
So, and if there's an issue that comes up that we're concerned about, so just recently, for example, around the relocations, there were questions being raised by tenants about why they were redeveloping, or why they were relocating people out of the space that was going to become the park, for which council had to be given 2 years' notice to be able to prepare its requirements, and then there was another 2 years to actually deliver the park. So that was 4 years. People living in the park were basically being given relocation letters now. And so tenants were saying, well, why is this happening? There aren't, they haven't even started building in stage 1 yet, so there aren't any places for us to build, and we're being moved out. So in that situation, we went back to both Land and Housing Corporation and asked them for a response, and to the City of Sydney, because it was going to be their park, for them to respond. And then we did a piece in the local paper about that issue and the responses from both of those. So sometimes it might be in an email update, sometimes it might be in an article that I might do for the South Sydney Herald. It changes depending on what's happening, but you're basically having to talk to people. And one of the problems with council is councillors can't talk to council staff unless they've got particular approval to do it. So it's not much use asking a councillor sometimes about what's happening as far as council officers, because they're not allowed to talk to them, which is one of the things a community group can do. It can talk to whoever it wants to.
You've been very, very effective at understanding the lay of the land.
You have to be.
Yeah, you are particular. I guess that's the longevity of the process, that the years that you've been doing this for, which is most probably hard for a lot of newcomers, and who are looking, say, in new communities, looking to establish community organisations, like just trying to understand the planning system, trying to understand state versus local politics, everything that we're talking about now, like there's the wealth of information that sits like within you, and also the people that work with you is massive. And then I guess as well, the level of respect that you now have as a community organization, with somebody from, the Office of Lord Mayor coming to your meetings. You know, most probably you have a great relationship with most probably the local media as well. Those things are, hats off to you. It's fantastic what you've been able to achieve.
I mean, I guess the thing about planning is that it's not just about planning. It's about politics. It's about
It's everything.
bureaucracy. It's about personalities.
Yes.
You could be dealing with a government authority and have one person that takes one approach to dealing with the community, and then they go and someone comes in with a totally different approach, and you've got to sort of start doing things a different sort of way. So it is about, it's a change. You're talking about social change. It just happens to be in the planning system. It has politics involved in it. It has personalities, and it has relationships, and you need to, be able to exercise different ways of doing things in each of those spheres to be able to have a voice for your community.
Are you worried, I guess, about the planning trajectory we find ourselves on? We've had, a number, again, under the banner of solving the housing crisis. We've had the transit-orientated precincts, we've had the floor space ratio and height incentives for the provision of affordable housing, we've had the housing delivery authority and the delineation of projects as state significant and the opportunity then to go down a different statutory pathway. We now have a community participation plan, draft community participation plan on exhibition, as you said earlier, cutting down the notification periods from 28 to 14 days. And a huge push to keep sort of trying to reduce the red tape. Like, what are you concerned about where it's all heading?
Yes, I am. I am concerned because I think it's about trying to streamline a process that really, it's a bit like if it's the old saying that if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So in the current climate, it's create more housing as quickly as you possibly can, right? It's not about the mix of housing. So we've gone through with Todd's and we haven't really captured the value that gets added in those sites to be able to deliver affordable housing on scale, or even community facilities that are going to service that. We have a government that's prepared to do everything for affordable housing other than to put significant amounts of money into that, or a social housing system that's sort of contracted with a whole pile of people in Western Sydney in multiple family houses and people not being able to keep roofs over their heads, and we don't have a response for those parts of the housing system that the market can't handle, right? So my worry is that what we're doing at the present moment is basically continuing to go down a market-driven approach rather than actually dealing with some of the broader issues. And if you go down a market-driven approach only for a place like Sydney, you're not going to have the key workers and the people that you actually need to run the system. You get a little bit like, Silicon Valley, where, you can't afford to have the people to come in and actually look after your house and do certain things because, they can't afford to live in the area. So that's one of my big concerns, that I think there are things that we're missing out on. I also think that we really haven't come to grips with the connection between planning and well-being. We're basically still very much in terms of housing delivery rather than looking at whether or not what we deliver actually adds to community and personal well-being and how that is going to work. So I was at a session last night where they were talking about the Welsh model for doing stuff in terms of well-being and how that's changing the way they're doing their planning system. So I think there's some things like that worry me a bit, that we're sort of careering down a road, but I'm not sure that that's a helpful road, because where we're going to end up is still going to have a whole pile of things that we need that we don't have. And I don't think there is a planning department at the present moment that is prepared for things like social impact assessments to actually reel in developers and make them actually do the things that they're saying that they should be doing. Now, in some cases that might not matter much, but in the case of Waterloo South, if the metro site does a social impact assessment and doesn't actually recognise that you've got a high need social housing community that's the lowest deciles as far as their access, and then doesn't look at what the impact of the development is on that, then you run into problems. And we've seen that already in Waterloo, where the developer on that site has had to employ the police, off-duty police, to actually be on site to be able to make sure that there isn't conflict between the locals and people that are working on the site. I mean, that's the sort of thing that social impact assessments are basically put in place to try and head off. And so if you make suggestions like, well, people that are coming in on this site need to be trained in terms of dealing with people with complex mental health and complex issues, that should be there needs to be some people that do that. You need to be able to de-escalate these situations rather than rely on the police to come in and do it. It's not only expensive, but it's also, not good at building up a relationship with the local community. So there are things that I think we haven't really got right in that. And I keep coming back, we've got a whole pile of government-owned land that's sitting there that is taking ages to actually get, 20 years in the case of, and still counting as far as North Everleigh, right? I mean, and yet everyone's talking about needing to accelerate the system.
Development. I know. We need it, but build it. Oh, so just a couple of questions to bring us to a close. What do you think the future of RedWatch looks like? Is there a new generation of active community members coming through who can carry your work forward? Is community advocacy alive and well?
So we've got a little bit of the problem that the human services sector has and the city has, in that we have people that live in the area who become involved, but then can't afford to live in the area and have to move out. Right? So we've had a number of younger people that have become involved that just can't continue to live in the area and leave. We've also had people that have come through that have basically moved on to other things, and that's important. We've got people who have gone on to be counsellors, for example, people who are academics, people in the media, one to a local MP. So people that have come through have learnt skills and go on to contribute in other ways. I think the difficult bit in terms of the sort of role that I play is that I put a lot of time into that initially, helped by the fact that I was running a business that was sort of import-export and was separated by time from people that I was dealing with. So therefore I had the flexibility to be able to move my time around and do stuff during the day as well as during the evening. And now I'm retired, so I've got some of that flexibility. But there is a big time demand in terms of being able to do that. And if you're busy trying to pay the rent, right? That's very difficult to do unless you're sort of retired or in a position where you're self-funded in some sort of way. So it's difficult. People keep saying, yes, it's important, and you keep finding people that'll step up to be involved on our coordinating committee and to be involved. But I suspect what will happen is that after I leave, there will be a change in the way in which it happens, and some of the things that we currently do just won't happen because there won't be time for them to happen. But I still think there'll be a Red Watch there that'll see itself as having a role of trying to engineer community voices into discussions and to try and get outcomes that work for the community as well as for the proponents.
Well, I certainly hope it continues. We need to work out how to bottle you, Jeff. For communities elsewhere in Australia who, are wondering how to tackle development pressures or just social pressures that are occurring within their own areas and want to become more active and engaging in advocacy, what advice would you share to them? How do they start a Red Watch?
They start a Red Watch by having a group of people or pulling together a group of people that have a commitment to trying to make their community better and have a voice in things that impact them. Irrespective of what the issue is, you need to have that grouping of people, and then you need to network out to others within the community that already exists there. You don't bring about change just by being an isolated group. You have to be connected back into the human services and the service clubs and all the other bits and pieces that make up the community. You have to recognise that communities are diverse and there are lots of different views within communities. So you have to be very careful about what things you pull together as the common threads that you're working around. And then you need to do some good analysis. You need to understand if you're going to working in the planning space, then you need to learn about the planning space. You might not have a Peter Phibbs to come in and do a planning for non-planners for you, as we did on a couple of occasions, but there are lots of other people in universities or in councils that can actually teach you about how that system works. You have to understand and learn a bit about politics.
Yes, a lot about politics.
and how the system works, both formally and informally, how to deal with bureaucrats. And from my perspective, you need to be transparent in that. Right? When we put out a newsletter, it goes to people in government, in developers, as well as tenants. We don't play this game that some people play, which is, we're afraid that people are going to see what we're doing and somehow thwart it. So, don't tell anybody anything, right? No. If it's valid and it's going to have some clout, then it needs to be something that stands up to criticism, to people's responses, and continually say to people, if we've got this wrong, then you tell us, right? We want to know because, we're not making stuff up. We're trying to represent our community and deal with stuff. So there are a series of skills that come to actually make an effective group. Red Watch isn't funded. And we did that quite deliberately because we didn't want to be in a position where anybody could actually sort of pull the funding line to try and stop that. We do get some income from some of the guided tours that we do that sort of brings together our sort of our day job and sort of our fundraising. But by and large, we don't want to be spending our time fundraising. We want to be spending our time actually working on the issues. But you've got to have people that have time, and that is difficult for some age groups within the community, and for some parts of the community. So you've got to actually work with whatever you've got, and build from there.
Well, Jeff Turnbull, you're an incredible champion. Take my hat off to you. You're amazing. Thank you so much.
Been a pleasure to be here.
Absolute pleasure to have you. If you have questions or thoughts to share, click the link in our show notes. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're a developer or working on a project that needs an online presence or community engagement, reach out through the same link. Alternatively, you can visit urbantalk.com.au. Don't forget to follow, leave a rating and a review. It really helps more people find the podcast and keeps the conversations going that shape our cities. I'm your host, Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the Urban Talk podcast.
Consulting with the community about your proposed development or planning project can be daunting and challenging, especially when media and local action groups drive public perception. But now there's a cost-effective way to avoid misrepresentation and ease public tension and resistance towards your project. Introducing UrbanTalk. UrbanTalk is Australia's first property development and community engagement platform. Establish a digital presence for your project that raises community awareness, answers questions, and promotes greater understanding of urban planning and development. Intuitive templates, developed using 30 years of community consultation experience, allow you to easily create a comprehensive listing for your project. Populating fields with information already at hand, your project listing becomes the community information hub, a source of truth that provides straightforward explanations, images, videos, and centralizes all inquiries. Your listing is supported by site signage, notification postcards, and newsletters that direct people to the page, with the ability to track public interest in the project. Now you can provide a reliable source of information in English and 10 other languages, creating an avenue for inquiry to gain community trust and improve the path to project approval. Create your project listing today.